The first of our poems by Sylvia Plath is Daddy. And before we actually start talking about the poem, I wanted to mention that there is in this poem, and also in Lady Lazarus, several German words or phrases. They're not complicated ones. You might be able to figure them out even if you haven't studied German. But I've highlighted them in yellow in advance. It's not much. On this first slide, the ach du simply means oh you. Uh, so du means you, and ach is you. Oh you. Yeah, okay. And then this on the second slide, which we'll see in a few minutes, the word ich, and it's spelled I-C-H, is the German word for I, and that is means I, not like eye that you blink. I as in me. I'm going to change the pen here for a minute. Later on in Lady Lazarus, there's make references to Herr Doktor or Herr Gott, spelled H-E-R-R, and this is a German word simply for a polite address for Mr. Okay, so it just means Mr. Doctor. But the word Herr is also used for Lord, as in Herr Gott means Lord God. And then one other thing, I would recommend to you to watch the YouTube video of Sylvia Plath reading this poem that I've put on the Course Connect page. There's a link there, and she has kind of a very distinguished kind of a voice. She has a Boston accent, but anyway, this poem is meant to be heard. I think this is a really astonishing poem in some ways. And unlike people like T.S. Eliot, she actually knows how to read poetry pretty well. Okay, so this is Plath, one of her most famous poems. And even with a first reading, it seems pretty astonishing with bold references to the Holocaust and concentration camps and other Nazi things. And all of this in connection to her father. I mean, wow! It would be really easy to conclude that she was oppressed by her father, that she hated him, even that he was some kind of a monster. But in reality, she idolized him. And when he died, when she was 8 or 9 years old, she was traumatized and cast into a deep depression. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the Electra complex, but in short, it's kind of like the female version of the Oedipus complex that was developed by Freud. And Freud also did talk about the female version of this, and also the psychoanalyst Jung developed this as well, and he's the one who called it the Electra complex. But in any case, it has to do with a girl who initially identifies with the mother, but then becomes attached to the father and sees the mother as being in competition for her attention to her father. And this is, I guess, according to Freud, somewhat normal. But if something happens in the development to interrupt this kind of development, there can be a kind of arrested development, and it could lead to neurosis. Jung also goes on to develop an idea called a dead father complex, in which a case that if a child is a certain age, and the age that Sylvia Plath was, and the father dies, it causes lots of problems, because there's both a love of the father and the close attachment to the father, but then also a hostility toward that parent because he left her. All right, so this poem, if anything, I think really dramatizes just such a relationship, because, as I said, Plath was really attached to her father, and in this poem it seems as if she has this hostility, but the hostility comes from the fact that he has left her to go on in the world by herself. Her short life was characterized by depression. She tried to commit suicide at the age of 20. She was treated with electroshock therapy, among other therapies, as a result of that. And after a failed marriage and 2 children, she did commit suicide in her early 30s. Some of these details are alluded to in both of this poem and Lady Lazarus, as we will see. All right, so let's maybe take a closer look at the poem itself. In the first stanza, there's a very interesting play on words here with you do not do, you do not do. I mentioned that the phrase ach du that we saw down here, that the word du, du, is you, is the word for you in German, and so you do not do. So she's kind of there's a lot of I's and U's, and you put them together, and this is the crux of the issue, is that this relationship between the two. The black shoe reference, which I've kind of crossed out there. Okay, the black shoe reference is something that I think also comes up in Lady Lazarus. She's kind of characterizing her life as a shoe that she has lived in for 30 years, barely daring to breathe. It's almost like a cocoon-like existence that she has been living as a result of her father's death. In the second stanza, look at the images associated with this daddy, with the father. Larger than life, heavy, marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one great toe. The great toe, I think, refers to the father had diabetes and something was wrong with his toe as a result. But look at these other images. There is another poem of hers called Colossus, and that's another poem in which she's erecting this monumental image of the father, only to want to tear it down. But going back to the beginning of this stanza, she says, "Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time." So how can she kill him if he's already dead? An interesting idea. I think we'll come back to that, though. I think it's more of a psychic destruction of that father image. And then in the third stanza, the only other thing I'll mention too is, you have this negative thing about wanting to kill the father, but she also says here, "I used to pray to recover you," and later on she'll say other things about this. There's both love and hate. It's in this fourth stanza where she begins the transformation of the image of the father into a Nazi. So German tongue, Polish town. She's going back to, I'm going to switch to the next image here where it says, "My Polak friend says there are a dozen or two, so I could never tell you," etc. I think that what she's doing there, she's referring to Buchenwald, which is one of the names of concentration camps. There are other ones of some of the more famous concentration camps down here below, but she says there are a dozen or two. So anyway, I'm not sure how important it is, but it's just another concentration camp. In this fifth, and even also in the sixth stanza, the speaker has had to carry around this image of the father. It has been a burden to her. So that this is, and she refers to the black shoe in the first stanza, like her life is kind of consumed or restricted by this burden of the father. And it intimidates her to a point where, she seems to be combining an inability to speak with a kind of stuttering or almost a choking. So I refer to this word ich, or ich, as you say in German. It just means it's stuck in a barbed wire snare. I could hardly speak. But the very guttural sound of ich is also kind of a choking sound or stuttering sound. And so she says, "I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you, and the language obscene." As the figure of the father grows more into a tyrannical Nazi, she begins to identify more with being a Jew in a concentration camp. And so that when we talked about the choking, the chuffing me off like a Jew, I began to talk like a Jew. Now I should clear up here that the Plath family was not Jewish, and so she's just taking in this the idea of the Nazi and the Jew relationship to make use of it for her intentions here. And then in the eighth stanza, she throws in the possibility of being a gypsy for good measure. This is maybe only significant, and I don't know why that is misspelled either, but um, um, the reason I think that she tosses that in is that gypsies were also people that were thrown in concentration camps, not just Jews, but gypsies, homosexuals, etc. A couple more German words here. Luftwaffe is the German word for Air Force, and so the Nazi Luftwaffe was very notorious for being very successful, for one thing. The word Panzer in German means tank, so a Panzerman is a tank man. So more military references that are highly associated with the Nazis. I want to mention that in the video of Plath reciting the poem, there is a photo of her father at one point that is superimposed over a photo of Sylvia herself. And in that photo, the father does have a small, neat mustache. And I was just assuming that his eyes were blue in that very Aryan way. Okay, so. And then in the next stanza, I mean, more really bold, kind of disturbing Nazi imagery. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. Pretty intense. I didn't mention this earlier, but the reference to being at the picture of the daddy at the blackboard, her father was a college professor, and so that's the explanation you have of that. The black man who bit her pretty little heart in two is a reference to, it's not a black man in terms of being African American or African. It's another black as like a Nazi. But that's a reference to her ex-husband, I should say, British poet Ted Hughes. Even though she was not quite 10 when her father died, Plath, both here and in Lady Lazarus, likes to, even though she was not quite 10 when her father died, Plath, both here and in Lady Lazarus, likes to think of her trauma and her suicide attempts in round numbers of 10 and 20 and 30. So notice that despite the dark and brutal references to the Nazi father earlier, now she tries to die to get back to him. So I was 10 when they buried you. I was 20. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. In the next stanza, and in a way similar again to Lady Lazarus, the speaker here makes reference to the doctors who, likely against her wishes, pulled me out of the sack, stuck me together with glue. She then suggests that this is when she creates the Nazi model of her father. Right, so the Mein Kampf look, right? So Mein Kampf, you probably know this, but this is the title of the book by Hitler that was so big in the Nazi period. Mein Kampf, the title means my struggle. In the 14th stanza, there's another very memorable and resonant line. And I said, I do. There is an additional play on words here. Okay, so I and do. Remember that do in du is that German word for you. So the I and you, but also in addition to that, there's the I do from marriage vows. So more evidence of this electra complex that we were talking about earlier. In the last two stanzas, we have another reference in which she says, I've killed two men. That is another reference to Ted Hughes, her ex-husband. And so another suggestion here about with the electric complex, because he says the vampire who said he was you. So in that kind of electric complex, the unresolved feelings for the father suggests that she looks for men who will take his place. In these last two stanzas here, we also have kind of a startling morphing of the image of the Nazi into a vampire, to Dracula even. A vampire that she's killed by driving a stake into his heart. All right, so these last lines, the villagers never liked you, they're dancing and stamping on you, Daddy, Daddy, you bastard. I'm through some memorable lines. So I've decided with Lady Lazarus that I'm not really going to go through and explicate the poem or talk about it, except to maybe sort of introduce some ideas. And then I'm going to use this poem for you to respond to a question or two on the discussion board. So it'll be more of your own interpretation. But I wanted to say a couple things about it. First, that it's another pretty astonishing and impressive poem in terms of the images that they're disturbing, but they're very memorable. And in it, she had always been interested in this image of Lazarus. So I hope that this is a biblical reference that you will remember. I know sometimes biblical references don't seem to be things that people know anymore, but Lazarus was the guy in the gospel who Jesus raised from the dead, and in that story, the two, Martha and Mary, are his sisters, and they are grieving, of course, and one of them goes out to meet Jesus. The other one stays home with the body, and when Jesus goes to see him, they say, "Oh, don't go in there because he's been in there for a couple of days. He's going to be beginning to smell, and he's wrapped up in the bandages or like a burial shroud." And so there are a number of places in this poem here where she's talking about her skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. I don't know if you know that they used to make lampshades out of the skin of Jews during in the concentration camps. But then peeling off the napkin, and later on, they unwrap me hand and foot, the big strip tease. So she's making this poem something about Lazarus, but also in the end she comes back to life at each of these three times that she's referring to. And so it's also kind of combining the Lazarus story with the myth of the phoenix. So the speaker is describing herself as every 10 years having this big dramatic performance in which she is put back together, stuck together with glue, as it said in the previous poem. And the doctors here are ones, she refers to Herr Doctor, Herr Enemy. I am your opus, I am your valuable. She is the one who's being taken apart, and they are the ones that are performing in front of an audience. All right, so you will have a question on this to answer, which will be on the dramatic context of this poem, and that'll be on the Course Connect page for you. I'm just going to say one more thing about like the last poem, the last stanza is particularly memorable and this has to do with that idea of the phoenix. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. Wow. All right, this last poem, Mirror, is obviously a little bit shorter than the other two that I asked you to read. And I was thinking about including that because, um, well, for the sake of variety, not just in terms of length, but, well, maybe to get away from the preoccupation with death and suicide. Um, this poem is like many of Plath's poems, a poem of a confessional nature. I mean, when I've been preparing for this class and I'm going through some literary criticism, this is a term that comes up a lot, that she's deemed to be confessional. I mean, talking about herself. She seems to get some kind of therapeutic benefit out of writing about her problems. But it is a confessional poem, like the others, but it's much more subtle, but moving in a very subtle way. Well, let's take a look at it. The poem is pretty straightforward in terms of its delivery. I mean, it's a personification. I mean, the top is called Mirror, and the speaker is a mirror, and so it's a personification of a mirror. I am silver and exact. And what does the mirror do? It reflects faithfully whatever is before it. I have no preconceptions. Whatever I see, I swallow immediately, just as it is, unmisted by love or dislike. I am not cruel, only truthful. The eye of a little god for a corner. I've spent some time thinking about the structure, the format of the poem. Clearly there's no rhyme, there's no regular meter. There are two stanzas. Each of them is 9 lines long, but they're not really that same. I mean, I drew a line here to kind of look at the first stanza as like, all right, I'm a mirror, this is what I do. But in the last 4 lines of the stanza, the mirror is now talking more about how she spends her time. Most of the time I meditate on the opposite wall. Think about that. The view of a mirror all day long is most of the time pretty empty. But then at the end, it flickers. Faces and darkness separate us over and over. Right, so in the second stanza, faces and darkness are going to come up again. Right, now I am a lake. Right, so the mirror speaks again. Why a lake? Well, because the woman who's bending over her is crying. I mean, there are tears and agitation of hands, and so it's kind of a slightly different perspective, because it's not the mirror looking out at the wall or the faces or the darkness, but the woman looking into the mirror. Now, her perspective is what makes it a lake, because the tears are clouding the rather truthful, exact reflection that the mirror usually provides. I find it an interesting change that the speaker is not from the perspective of Sylvia Plath or someone like Sylvia Plath, but it's something that's outside of her. She thinks the speaker, the mirror, speaks of the woman who bends over the mirror in the third person, and that person is, in this confessional manner, someone who is like Sylvia Plath. In addition to the difference between the exact reflection being different, because now she says, now I'm a lake, it also, she turns to those liars, the candles or the moon. So the image is of a woman who keeps looking in the mirror, afraid of what she's seeing, and the candles or the moon reflect a certain kind of light that, I think maybe it's more obvious than I'm making it sound, but the softness of the light of candles or the moon is less, is more forgiving, I guess is the word I'm looking for. All right, so finally, I mentioned, here we faces in darkness are things that separate us over and over. Each morning, it is her face that replaces the darkness. In me, she has drowned a young girl, and in me, an old woman rises toward her day after day. And then the rather surprising last image, like a terrible fish. I mean, it might be surprising because, if you think of Sylvia Plath, who this is a little bit earlier of a poem than the other two, so she may have be 30 or 28 or 29, but she has a broken marriage. She has 2 children that she is struggling to take care of, and has been suffering from depression for a long time. And so the idea of her looking in the mirror every day, searching for something that she can't find, feeling like a drowned girl. She's not old, of course, but maybe anticipating the eventuality of growing old without really being able to solve the problem that she's dealing with. And then the image of a terrible fish, I don't know what to make of that. It's a pretty sudden shift into an image that doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything else, except I guess if it's like a terrible fish, and she's talking about, now I am a lake, that there's a fish in the lake. But otherwise, it seems kind of a surprising last image, but not surprising in that Sylvia Plath seems to like to end her poems with such a surprising image or phrase.